Hade, bonjour, good afternoon, and welcome to the second panel on cross-sector CEO Outlook. Please have a seat. I want to acknowledge the land on which we are gathering today, the traditional territory of Clic-les-Ténés, and also acknowledge all Indigenous leaders in this room. It is a privilege to be here this week, and hearing my colleague Afonso Bison this morning, it makes me very proud to be part of Rio Tinto. But even more, to be part of a company that contributes to BC's overall goal of developing strong natural resource sector in a sustainable way. I want to take a moment to thank Sue for her enlightening presentation. I really feel energized by what lies ahead, and I realize that there's so much more to learn. Last night, we've learned from the survey results that British Columbians are very supportive of the resource sector. And this is confirmed by the record number of participants to this year's forum. The second panel is bringing together four CEOs to share a cross-sector view on how to strengthen BC's competitive advantage in the resource sector. They come from different horizons, and it's an honor to be part of an event that celebrates inclusion and diversity. Not only diversity from a cultural standpoint, but diversity in terms of mindset and ideas. This afternoon, we'll learn how innovation is embedded within BC's economy and how this will bring us forward. We'll hear about mining in the north and how First Nations are coming together to lead and own projects. We'll discuss how large energy projects benefit British Columbians, specifically First Nations, and finally, we'll find out why India matters to Canada, and we'll have a glimpse at Canada's diversification agenda. A brief intro of each CEO, and then I'm going to turn it to you. Raghwa Gopal is a serial entrepreneur who has extensive experience starting, growing, and selling numerous businesses. He joined Innovate BC as president and CEO from Accelerate Okanagan, where he was Chief Executive Officer and a driving force in the development of the Okanagan's tech sector into a $1.6 billion economic contributor. A graduate of New Zealand Central Institute of Technology, Raghwa has also received degrees in computer science. He serves on the boards of multiple organizations, including the University of British Columbia, India-Canada Innovation Council, Women's Enterprise Center, Central Okanagan Economic Development, and the province of BC's Emerging Economy Task Force. Our second panelist will be Paul Gruner, President and CEO of Det'on Corporation. His professional career was spent primarily in the north, including BC, Yukon, Alaska, and currently Northwest Territories, and has brought him in several industries, including oil and gas, civil construction, telecommunication, and manufacturing. Paul is a board member of the Northwest Territories Nunavut Chamber of Mines and the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. Peter Zebedee, CEO of LNG Canada, brings more than 22 years industry experience to his new role, which he took over this past July. Peter joined Shell in 2009, and he has held roles in engineering, operations, and corporate assignments. In 2018, he became vice president for Shell's downstream manufacturing portfolio in Canada and the general manager for Shell's Scotford manufacturing complex, one of the most effective GHG reduction technologies. Peter is a member of the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists, Alberta. And finally, the last panelist to give his remarks is Toronto-based. As the president and CEO of Canada-India Business Council, Kassi Rao advises corporations, universities, think tank, non-for-profit organizations, and different levels of government. His career includes strategic roles for the Asia-Pacific Foundation Toronto office, BMO Financial Group, the University of Toronto, and the province of Ontario. He has a bachelor from the University of Waterloo and a master from the University of Toronto. I'm sure you're getting more familiar now with Pigeonhole. So each CEO will give their remarks, and then you can go online and ask your question or vote for your preferred question. And then at the end, question that will have received the top voter will be answered by the panelists. Full bio of the CEO is available within the conference app, so please go there if you want to know more about their background. I'll be looking at my watch, so I don't want to be rude, but I'm also the timekeeper. So now, without further ado, turning it to Raghwa.
Thank you, Geneviève. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, to be part of this panel. And I would also like to acknowledge that we are gathered here on the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Lheidli T'enneh First Nations people. And I want to thank Sue as well. I mean, fantastic job on the presentation. Most of that I was going to talk about, you've already done, so I'm going to keep my presentation fairly short. So thank you for doing that. Which gives me a couple of seconds to talk about briefly about Innovate BC. Innovate BC connects BC's innovators to funding, resources, and support. We work with companies of all sizes, across all sectors, and all over the province. As a Crown agency, we represent the government of British Columbia and the people who make our innovation ecosystem in every corner of our province. We also run the BC Tech Conference, BC Tech Summit, which is Western Canada's largest annual tech conference, and the next one is coming up June 1st and 2nd, so mark your calendars for that. So today I'm going to talk about BC's tech and innovation sector. And like I said, I'm not going to repeat much of what Sue has said, but I will try and give you a pretty good snapshot of where the sector today is. And I will try and give some examples of innovation that are happening within the natural resources sector. So local companies that are actually doing some innovation that are very helpful for this particular sector. And time permitting, maybe give you a bit of an outlook of where I believe BC's tech sector is heading. So we have a very strong provincial tech sector that's growing rapidly year over year. And a little bit of snapshot, our tech sector contributes 6% to the provincial GDP. Our tech companies generate over $33 billion in revenue annually. We have more than 10,000 tech companies employing more than 114,000 people in the province. Now, that number goes to about 150,000 people if you count employees that are working for non-tech companies. The companies in British Columbia are among the best in the world. They're raising unprecedented amount of capital and solving real global challenges. As an example, BC tech companies raised over $2 billion in 2019, just last year. And 10 of those accounted for roughly $1.5 billion of investment raised. Most notable out of that, you probably all know about a homegrown Burnaby-based company, Clio, that last fall raised $250 million US dollars. Terramera, a local company as well that grown right in our own backyard, just recently raised approximately $50 million as well. We have one of the best clean tech ecosystems in the world, which includes companies like General Fusion, Carbon Engineering, and Saltworks. We are attracting companies from all around the world, companies like Amazon, Apple, MailChimp, and most recently, MasterCard. For people that are not aware, last week MasterCard announced a $500 million investment in British Columbia to create a cybersecurity center right downtown Vancouver. And it happens every day. Just yesterday, Shopify announced that they will be opening shop in Vancouver and hiring up to 1,000 workers. So $500 million investment, 1,500 people will be employed just over the last 2 weeks. That's what's happening here in British Columbia. That totally validates that BC is one of the most desirable and fastest growing tech ecosystems in the world. So as I mentioned, tech migration is happening. And we're seeing more, and we'll continue to see more and more of that. And it's not just the big giants that are coming from all over the world. We're seeing smaller companies starting to look at British Columbia as a place to set up shop. And almost on a daily basis, we're actually seeing world-class talent looking at British Columbia and making British Columbia their home. I want to briefly kind of touch on the clean tech sector because in the morning, both Minister Ralston and Minister Hemming talked about our burgeoning clean tech sector. So just a few numbers on that. BC boasts over 270 clean tech companies solving real world challenges while reducing environmental impacts. 1/3 of all Canadian clean tech companies are started or have started in BC. We are actually in the process of developing our own clean tech clusters to showcase BC's world clean tech economy to global industries and markets. 2 weeks ago, 5 BC companies made it to the Global Clean Tech 100 list. So we're already there. More than 5% of world's best clean tech companies are resided in British Columbia. And some of very notable investors in some of our clean tech companies are people like Jeff Bezos from Amazon. He's invested in General Fusion. And Microsoft from Bill Gates from Microsoft, not Microsoft, Bill Gates, the other way around. He has invested in carbon engineering as well. Now let me give you some examples of BC innovation that's actually transforming the natural resources sector. So traditional industries will need to embrace innovation and will need to adopt technologies to compete on a global market. There's no denying of that fact. But the good news is tech companies across all of the province are developing innovative solutions that are making our traditional industries more competitive, efficient, and profitable. I'll give you a couple examples. Llama Zoo, a company based out of Victoria, through their virtual reality and augmented reality, they help natural resource clients clarify complex data to make impactful business decisions. Some of the clients include Tech Resources, Chevron, and Goldcorp. Another example is Finger Food. They recently expanded into Alberta as well. And they use advanced technologies like virtual reality, blockchain, and robotics to improve the way people work, play, and interact with the world. Some of the clients include Microsoft, Lululemon, KPMG, and a number of natural resources companies that are actually in this room right now. And a local success story, Spark Geo, a company started and based here in Prince George. They have been providing geospatial expertise to a lot of companies in many sectors all around the province and the country. So there are a lot of innovations that are happening right in our own backyard. They'll be helping all of these traditional industries, especially in the natural resources sector. Companies like MindSense that I haven't mentioned. So what's the future of innovation and tech in British Columbia? BC will continue to become world leaders in key developing sectors like clean tech, virtual reality, and life sciences. We're already home to the second biggest VR/AR ecosystem in the world. And this industry is already disrupting industries like mining, real estate, and education all over the world. We have some of the world's best life science companies, including Zymeworks, Aspect Biosystems, and Terramera. Terramera is a company that the goal is to reduce synthetic chemicals used in agriculture globally by 80% by 2030. That's in less than 10 years, and while increasing farm production by 20%. So as you see, these are some amazing innovations that are happening that we should be very proud of, and that this is where BC is going. Our AI sector is starting to gain a lot of momentum, and our quantum is definitely, we're leaders in quantum computing as well. So the future of BC's tech and innovation sector looks very, very bright. We will continue to see unprecedented growth for the next foreseeable future. Although we're very proud of our tech and innovation sector, the best is yet to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Raghwa. As we transition to Paul, I'm inviting you to go to Pigeonhole if you want to start putting up your question. Paul, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you. Really excited to be here today. I want to give a quick shout out to any UNBC alumni in the room. So I lived here in the 90s and then came back, did my master's again about 10 years ago. So very proud to be part of UNBC. Lived in the North for a number of years. It was a bit of an experiment. And if you talk to anybody from the North, they will talk to you about going up for a week or two and 10 years, 20 years later, which would be the result of myself. Today I want to talk a little bit about the corporation I'm currently with, which is Det'on Corporation, which is Yellowknives Dene First Nations, based out of Yellowknife. Our traditional area is right in and around the capital city. I want to give you a couple of key stats to really paint the picture for the corporation and our evolution. Our major industry in the territory is diamond mines. And we've got 3 very large diamond mines producing today. We've got 1 care and maintenance, history of gold. So it's a very large mining jurisdiction. So last year we did $2 billion of rough cut diamonds, making Canada, because of that NWT production, the 3rd largest producer of diamonds in the world. It's also very remote in terms of accessing those mines. So we also boast the largest ice road built every year in the world. I think at about 500 kilometers or so that goes in. And those ice roads, when they go in, we have to resupply those mines in about an 8-week period. So there's some incredible logistic challenges that come with that. With some weather challenges historically, we've even gone as far as resupplying those using HERCs. So it can be very costly. I'll focus on sort of what our work does comes down to around the resource sector, being a resource conference. We're pretty diversified, but we do a lot of work around that. The corporation's been around for about 30 years. It's a non-settled First Nation, and with that comes some inherent challenges. My background, I've worked with settled First Nations, capitalized, land rights, et cetera. A non-settled First Nation has additional challenges, of which being access to capital. So over that 30 years, they started with a $15,000 grant, and today we do between $70 to $100 million a year in revenue. We're one of the largest private employers in the territory, and if you combine ourselves with Talicho, which is another large First Nation that we work closely with, we're by far the largest private employer, and we actually employ as many local people as all the diamond mines combined. So it's pretty impressive when it comes to that, down to that Indigenous business side. So a lot of our business around the resource sector is really around servicing those mines. So we do a predominant amount of the camp catering, construction. So we built a lot of the mines through partnerships and now build the ice roads on an annual basis. Logistics. So we've got the largest logistics company that we've built from scratch, based in the north. We just recently did an acquisition and looking at doing more to expand that operation. And then we're getting more now into the reclamation mediation side. So there's progressive reclamation that's taking place with those mines, and then with some of the large mines, historical mines in the territory. So we've got really good existing cash flow. We put a lot of time into job creation capacity building. We've gotten really well recognized for that over the last couple of years. That's run by our own members, a division that really focuses on that. So at about 800 employees, we've got a fair amount of turnover of that. So I think we've got about 600 local people. And we're actively working with not just our First Nation, but with other First Nations to ensure that they're gainfully employed. But it's also sort of tackling that glass ceiling. So we put a lot of emphasis and time into ensuring that it's not just about having basic jobs, but looking at how do we get through into more progressive career-based type paths. So we work with all the companies, all of our partnerships, to identify opportunities right from the start and then working their way through. And we put an emphasis right within the corporation on that as well. So when I got there 3 years ago, I think the head office was about 16, 18 people. We tried to keep our overhead costs at a lower level. We had about 1 community member. Today we're at about 50%. And we're actively looking at how to get people into senior leadership, education, et cetera. So I think we really started to evolve, and the Indigenous business side it can be a bit of a tricky one. So that 30 years history has not been without its bumps and valleys. It's a pretty well-known story for a lot of Indigenous groups and that the evolution of business can be a bit challenging. So over the last 3-4 years, we put a ton of time into really the hard business side of it. So all the financial piece, the business planning, a lot of time into risk management, cash flow projections, et cetera. And as a result of that, we've been able to clean up that balance sheet, access to capital, and really seeing our bottom line results improve dramatically. So what does that mean? Where are we going? Well, that gives us greater opportunity because, again, going back to being a non-settled First Nation, it's not like we get buckets of capital thrown at us. We've got to go find our own. So with the changes that we've been able to make, we've been able to get more into that acquisition piece. We're now evolving into sort of the equity ownership. So we're looking at key infrastructure that's being developed. Tallston Power Project, which is a big one that's going forward. It's $1 billion to electrify a lot of the communities and resource projects. There's a large infrastructure project to go the Slade Geological Corridor up into Innovate, to the Grays Bay Port, actively engaged and looking at equity participation around that. And a really big one that we just announced last week at Roundup is we're going to be the first mine manager of a rare earths project that's going forward, and we're supplying and getting prepared for that this winter on the ice road. That's the first time in history of an Indigenous community on their traditional land overseeing that with one of our technical partners. And as we evolve that project over the next couple of years, we're looking at how do we have equity participation going forward on that play as well. So, we take a lot of our learnings, and this is where I encourage people to sort of look at the Indigenous business space, particularly for those companies in the resource sector. Alaska's got some great examples. We sat down with NANA Corporation last week and introduced them to some of our key folks. I've known NANA for quite a while, since my time working in Alaska and Yukon. Last year they just did 1.7 billion US. They own 35% of Red Dog Mine, which is one of the most prolific zinc mines in the world. And then Det'on Corporation was there as well from Fairbanks, which is heavily involved in the oil and gas sector. And those guys are doing some great work, really actively participating and growing their businesses. So I want to sort of leave you with sort of a couple of thoughts around key stakeholders. So if I'm looking at Indigenous groups that are in the room, look at opportunities that you can sort of challenge the status quo. There's incredible amounts of opportunities out there. There's abilities to access capital and build your workforce. For industry, look at ways that you can engage with those Indigenous groups and their corporations. It's not just about going out and applying the work. It's helping them build that governance structure, the finance side, accessing capital, the controls, et cetera. If we can do more work and time around that, getting Indigenous groups invested in projects, they're going to be more likely to see those projects go forward and invested in the future. Communities, Prince George, et cetera, great opportunities for creating employment. Again, going back and looking at Det'on and Talicho as major employers and growing our local workforce. And at the end of the day, everybody benefits and wins when we have strong Indigenous corporations that are succeeding, contributing to that local economy, and overall growing the workforce. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Peter.
Okay, well, maybe I'll start with a quick story from my weekend. And for those of you who haven't met me, I'm a pretty big hockey fan. And I went to the All-Star game in St. Louis this weekend with my son, and it was just a fantastic experience. Wayne Gretzky was there, so I got to see him coach the Pacific team from the bench, and it was really kind of inspiring to see him there, being the greatest player to ever play the game. Wayne's dad, Walter, had this famous saying about, Wayne, when you're playing hockey, you want to skate to where the puck's going, not where it's been. And if I reflect, that's really analogous to what we were doing here at LNG Canada and our work in developing this opportunity for us as British Columbians and Canadians. We are now well into our construction phase, and last year or 2 years now ago, we took a positive FID, so that's kind of our past. But where we are going is important, and it's important in the context of eliminating poverty, in growing our Canadian economy, and providing the world access to clean energy, to protect the environment here in British Columbia and indeed across the world, and offering real solutions in a very positive way forward. And so that's where we're going. LNG Canada represents opportunities not only for us here in British Columbia and Canada, but indeed for the world. And so I'd like to share with you a little bit about my outlook on a few of these opportunities. The first of which is obvious. We are opening new markets for export and trade. LNG Canada is a long-life asset. We have a 40-year export license, so we are here for many decades to come. Historically and today, the largest market for the export of energy and trade, 89% of it is the United States. And going forward, opening up opportunities to export our clean British Columbia gas to Asian markets is absolutely something that's quite fantastic, but also protects us against the U.S. increasing its shale gas production, as an example, which went up 11% last year alone. Along with that, the world needs more energy. The world's population is increasing, and forecasts are that there will be a 27% increase in energy demand by 2040. And we're here to help fill that space in an environmentally responsible way, done safely here with the right rules, oversight, and regulation here in British Columbia. Secondly, also obvious, there are lots of opportunities for shared economic growth and prosperity. LNG Canada, over its lifespan, will contribute many billions in dollars in royalties to provincial governments, and we will all benefit from that through the investment in critical pieces of infrastructure services. And so as residents of British Columbia, we can certainly look forward to that. There is also the opportunity for us as individuals. During the construction phase between ourselves and Coastal GasLink Pipeline, we will employ well over 10,000 workers, the majority of which will come right here in British Columbia. And as we move into sustaining operations, we'll employ about 900 workers to operate our facilities. As I mentioned in my talk yesterday, there are well over 1,500 workers at the end of 2019 up in Kitimat actively working to construct the site, and we will more than double that by the end of 2020. So this is a real opportunity, and it is now. We are also very close to completing the construction of our Workforce Accommodation Center, a purpose-built facility done in consultation with the local community and Indigenous stakeholders to accommodate what will be ultimately 4,500 workers at our site. And the first tranche of 1,400 beds will be ready by the end of April. We have, along with our prime contractor, JFJV, already contributed well over $1 billion in contracts here locally in British Columbia, over $500 million of those to Indigenous corporations. And we think that is obviously the right thing to do. And then finally, LNG Canada represents an opportunity for a cleaner, a more sustainable future, and it has a positive impact on the global environment. It's not just about what's good for BC, but it's also about what's good for the world. And our clean natural gas exported to Asia will help to offset significant greenhouse gas emissions generated by the burning of coal-fired emissions in Asia. It's up to 60 to 90 million tons, so a very disproportionate amount to what we actually emit here, which is good for all of us living under the same sky. It helps to address some big issues in China, where over 1.6 million people a year die from air pollution. So wrapping up, it's not just about what we've done or where we came from, but really about where we're going and how we plan to get there. LNG Canada has a vision for the future, and it's working, and it's here now.
Thank you, Peter. I would like to see some questions starting to put on my screen as we turn it to our last panelist, Hesse.
Thank you. My comments are in the space of diversification. It was almost 50 years ago that the then Prime Minister of Canada talked about the famous third option. And if anything, our dependence on traditional markets increased, it didn't decrease. And so one of the arguments that I have struggled with for a long time is, if the case is so compelling for diversification, why is it that the numbers are so low? And where we are at now is, historically, we've been able to be agnostic on this question. We've been able to take a pass on this question. But then when you look at some rather telling numbers, there is now a sense of urgency that is dawning upon us. So if you buy into the notion that the center of gravity, political and economic gravity, but particularly economic gravity, is shifting from the Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific, and that half of the world's growth is going to come from Asia, and 44% of the world's middle class is going to emanate from that part of the world, then a pivot to Asia will become increasingly not just more relevant and important, but will become a necessity for us. And in that context, I want to speak specifically about the case of India. We've talked about Japan, we've forgotten about Japan, and Japan has rekindled our interest and thankfully has reemerged on our radar screen. The case of China is well known. So if you think of the rise of Asia and you think of the early 80s, when you said Asia, it meant Japan. You fast forward another 15 years, when you said Asia, then it meant Japan and China. Then predominantly it became about China, and now we're focused on India. So a couple of things have happened, all of which point to a promising set of outcomes, in my view. The first is the unevenness that we're experiencing south of the border, Brexit, everywhere, has made the case for India a far more compelling proposition. But the story began well before then. So let me start with Asia, and then I'll focus on India. Last year, about 330 million people in Asia made their first online purchase. So just think about what those numbers are going to be in the coming future. And a large portion of that is now coming from what I call as ascending e-commerce, m-commerce markets, m-commerce meaning mobile commerce, and that is the case of India. In the case of India, 1 million people every month turn 18. So there is a demographic bulge that is emerging, an aspirational India that is demanding goods, products, services, in a way that we've never experienced before. About 15 years ago, Boston Consulting Group had done a study on the top 100 companies to watch in 2005, 2006. And of the top 100 companies, no surprise, 44 came from China and 21 came from India. You fast forward a few years later, same study, the top 100 companies to watch, 30 from China, 20 from India, and then quite a few from other newer emerging economies. So that trend is happening, and it is unmistakable. And I want to situate that in the context of my next two broad points. The first is just the rise of India, the rise of Asia, and why we cannot be agnostic to it anymore. And second, my second set of comments will be focused on the aspect of the Canada-India relationship. And despite tariff barriers and the like, we started from a very low base. We're at about $10 million in two-way trade and just under $3 billion in the services sector. Principally, it's about goods and commodities, but now it's moving into the services arena as well. And here I mean tourism, students across Canadian campuses and Canadian colleges that you see happening. And this is a bit anecdotal, but every year I hold a conference in Mumbai, typically in November. In my first year, about 3 years ago, we had 150 registrants. In our second year, we had 300 registrants. And in our third year, just concluded a few months ago, we had 450 registrants. So from the Indian side, there is an appreciation that Canada is perhaps the only, if not the only G7 country that has a free trade set of arrangements with other G7 countries, and our access to Asia, our access to Europe, and our access to North America makes us a truly unique place to live and do business in. That is being increasingly appreciated in many parts of Asia, and certainly in the case of India, which points to the increased numbers. The second is, I think from the Canadian side, there is now a sense of urgency. There is a sense that certainly when I make my phone calls, making the pitch, the return comes back rather quickly. And now a number of eminent Canadian CEOs are paying attention to India. perhaps none best represented than the CEO of Teck Resources. Teck has been a leader, and if you just look at Teck's numbers in terms of what they used to sell in China and what they used to sell in India, and you see that change now, they sell more into India than China. It is evidence that not just in the resources and commodities space, but indeed increasingly in the area of clean technologies and the like, that Canada and BC in particular has something distinct to offer. You were mentioning about the case of China. Pollution is, New Delhi is more polluted than Beijing right now in terms of the quality of air. So we've got tremendous opportunities coming up there. Let me conclude with why BC. I think BC historically has been the most outward-looking of Canadian provinces. It has played a leadership role in a way that we need for it to continue to play. And I think if you just look at the mix of BC's numbers going into India, from forestry to commodities in the area of coal for steel production and in the services arena, this is a very exciting time to be in the Canada-India space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 20 minutes for questions. So I would start with this one here on the top corner. So I would probably turn it to Peter to answer first. How can smaller communities outside of large urban centers like Vancouver diversify their economies by growing innovation technology ecosystem? So either Raghwa or Peter.
It's probably those.
Raghwa for innovation.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, happy to take that. I mean, we're already seeing some of the smaller communities, diversifying by promoting innovation and technology in the ecosystems. If you look at, Prince George as an example, there's a innovation central. They have a place where people can come. So if you're an innovator, if you have an idea, if you want to start a business, most of the time, people don't do that because they just don't know what are the process to go through, what are the business license issues or whatever, where they can get some funding, how they get to get some customers. So the way to do that is to provide those kind of services in smaller cities or smaller regions, to have centers or places where there's mentorship provided for those kind of things. There's access to some capital, in a small way. So creating a small angel network or family and friends, some kind of network where, seed capital is provided, and then, providing access to market for those innovators so they can, build something in their own town and maybe solving a problem that's actually is residing right in their own backyard, looking at an issue and trying to solve it. The reason they don't do it is because they just don't have that support. So by creating that support, I think we can encourage a lot of those innovations to happen all over the province.
Thank you. Now for the next question. Do you think Asia buys of energy and resource give any thought to the GHG intensity of the products they buy? And if so, is there a premium to be had for BC product?
Yeah, so I'll answer that one. I think the answer to that is absolutely less. All of our joint venture partners that are part of the LNG Canada partnership are countries that are signatories to the Paris Agreement. And so they have commitments under the Paris Agreement to meet certain emission targets. China, as an example, is actually allowed to grow its emissions intensity up until 2030, and they will continue to do so unless they are offered an alternative that they can actually grow their economy and reduce emissions at the same time. So, LNG from British Columbia and LNG Canada provides that opportunity for them to reduce emissions intensity by shutting down coal-fired generation plants, but also grow their economy at the same time. So will there be a premium associated with that? I mean, I think that remains to be seen as we look to, the partners in LNG Canada look to market the LNG. I would like to believe that to be true, but at the end of the day, we compete in a global economy, and our product must not only be clean and energy efficient, it must also be cost competitive. And so we look to do all of those things at the same time to ensure that we're big players in this global marketplace.
Maybe one for you, Paul. What is the role of your organization in preparing workers for future jobs in your sector, and what are the opportunities now, and are they different from those in the future?
Right. Great question. So actually, one of the boards I sit on is Future Skills Center for Canada, which is a national government looking at what are the future skills for Canadians. And it can be a real challenge. Obviously, when we talked about the technology clusters, which is fantastic in some of these large urban centers, I think some of the risk that we face is that we're continuing to draw the population from those northern regions into these larger places, creating higher cost of living, et cetera, et cetera. We really need to sort of focus on how do we retain and build those skills in sort of the smaller, could be more remote northern type locations. One of the challenges that we face in areas like ours, we've got a very tight labor market. Yukon right now has the lowest unemployment rate in the country at 2.5%. But that's very contingent and project specific, right? So as soon as you see some of these projects, mines, whatever, sunset, all of a sudden you free up a labor supply that has been skilled up, now has the ability that's portable and can relocate, and you're back to some of that same problem. So we've got to really focus. It's not just about creating the skills and the abilities, you've got to create the opportunities as well. And you do that in parallel with each other. And you can't have one without the other. So if I look at even what's taking place with LNG Canada, a fantastic project, you can have some huge pipelines going across the province, and then a major project at the end. You want to make sure that you continue to feed that system and have the opportunities because you've got those skills and you want to retain them at a local level.
I can talk a little bit about what Innovate BC does. We have a program called TechWorks program where we provide scholarships for co-op students. So trying to give them some experiential learning while they're still in university. They can go and work for a potential employer. And we at Innovate BC will cover a bunch of cost for that so that it becomes very cost neutral to the employer. So the employee gets the benefit of working in a real life working environment, and hopefully they continue to get hired as they graduate. So we also have another program, the Innovative Skills Initiative program, where so those recent graduates, if they were hired by those companies, there is an initial kind of learning period. So we have a grant that covers a little bit of that cost as well. And Sue talked about with the digital supercluster, the capacity building program is actually quite geared towards the training as well, taking in account a lot of diversity and inclusion kind of things. Bill's there, I'm pretty sure he can talk more about it. But there's definitely a program that's also available right now. And we'll be introducing hopefully a new program in the very near future, micro training, looking at, a sector, trying to understand what is the actual need, how many, resources are needed, and then kind of do a very focused micro training to fulfill those.
Thank you.
Can I add maybe just a little bit from the LNG Canada perspective? And we certainly see ourselves as a massive opportunity to train the next generation of skilled trades here in the province. We've set ourselves a target and a commitment of 20% of apprentices to be part of constructing our project and are currently meeting that. In addition, we've helped to fund and sponsor programs like our Your Place program, where we look to train up Indigenous and women and people who are not traditionally in the construction sector as part of the workforce. Overwhelming, in fact, really overwhelming support and applications into that program. We actually had to stop the application process. We had over 1,000 applicants, many of whom were Indigenous. Just graduated our first class of 12. They're out working on the site. So we certainly see that as part of really harnessing a section of our population that hasn't traditionally worked in projects such as ours.
And is this centralized in Kitimat, or is it?
Yeah, it's all in Kitimat area, yeah. But we accept applications from across the province.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Next question for Cassie. What is your opinion on the prospect of a Canada-India free trade agreement in the near term?
I don't think anything's going to happen in the near term. This is a set of discussions, two sets of discussions, one on what's called as the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, Free Trade Agreement, and the second is on Foreign Investment Protection and Promotion Agreement. So these are two separate sets of discussions, but related. They've been going on for 10 years and are at a bit of a standstill right now. From the Canadian side, almost $40 billion has gone into India from the long-term money, the institutional investors, and what they're seeking is some guarantees on dispute resolution and the like. And so their boards, corporate boards, have reached their risk tolerance levels. And so that's the interest from the Canadian side. From the Indian side, they want more access on our services side, migration, skilled migration, and the like. And so we're kind of talking past each other a little bit right now. There have been elections in both countries last year. I think it will restart, but the way it will come to a resolution is that in the case of India, it's not that they're singling Canada out. They're going to be looking at a host of countries and to see what works from their side. From our standpoint, I think increasingly India is becoming strategically inevitable because of the complications that I talked about that we see globally. And so it's a market we can't ignore. So we will keep making, increasing our trade and the like. I'd say it's incremental right now. For it to be transformative, obviously an agreement would help, but I don't see anything in the short to medium term.
Thank you, Cassie. The next question, if BC products are not price competitive with other suppliers, is there a risk of carbon leakage as they choose product from jurisdiction with lower environmental standards?
I think the short answer to that is absolutely yes. And we strive not only to be world leaders in GHG emissions from our facility. We are substantially above emissions, 50% better than the average emissions from any facility anywhere in the globe, 30% better than the next best. But we also have to bring a project in from a competitive basis, so from a capital cost efficiency standpoint, but also from an operating cost standpoint. We have structurally several advantages to our market in that we are geographically much closer to the Asian markets relative to our competitors, and therefore shipping costs are reduced. We have a highly skilled Canadian workforce that have built these big energy mega projects before. And so all of those factors combined put us in a very competitive spot in the global marketplace for LNG trading. But indeed, there is a risk of carbon leakage, for sure. Yeah.
Are we innovating fast enough in the resource industries to be competitive in the global marketplace? Where are the biggest opportunities and risks, and what can be done to accelerate innovation? Raghwa or Paul?
I'll jump in real quick, if that's okay. Not entirely my background, but interestingly enough, if you look at the three major resource, forestry went really through that in the 80s. Oil and gas, when I was involved in that, you saw a ton of innovation, non-conventional, and really trying to drive down costs. And we're now seeing that in the mining side. So, looking at the footprint and trying to get the labor side down and getting that variable cost lower, right? So, a good example of that, and this is one of the challenges going back to the labor side that we face in terms of engaging at a local level. De Beers has a mine operating at about 600 people, is what they'll have with various shifts. Their new mine proposed in Innovate through a lot of automation, drone-type technology is what they're talking about to reduce their camp footprint. So they would be bringing in food on a daily basis, pod types to house workers. All of that to bring down, from an environmental standpoint, bring down costs, et cetera. That 600-person mine will now be down to something like 50 or 60. Right, so the challenges being obviously around social license in terms of our standpoint, because employment being a huge factor around some of that stuff. And again, it's a global market. So even in production, say NWT, and we talk to our folks around that all the time, it's not specific to the territory or to the nation. We're very much in a global market space. We've got to be in terms of being the low-cost producer, right? So very challenging conversations when it comes to some of that stuff.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything, Raghwa?
Yes, I think as far as automation, I think, both the forestry industry and I think mining has done a really good job as far as automating things. As far as innovation, innovation is really not technology. Innovation is a different way of thinking. Innovation is a lot more than just tech. I don't think there has been a great amount of innovation in these traditional industries. So taking a tree as an example or lumber and just kind of selling that away somewhere. I mean, or looking at that and saying, how can we value add and make that into a little bit much value add product? Those are the kinds of innovation. I don't think that's happening. But as far as automation in bringing in technology, I think that part is happening already.
We have time for one or two more questions. What do you predict will be the most noticeable change in your sector 10 years from now? So maybe we can hear all of you. Very short answer.
I can start if you want. Or
I would say that I think one that is already underway, I mean, not so much in a sectoral perspective, but in a geographic sense, is I think the shift of the center of economic gravity. I think that is going to be profoundly impactful on our lives. The second thing, which has been talked about in the prior session as well, is the rise of digital and technology as the centerpieces of solution. And I think in the context of Asia, India, but context of Asia writ large, it will be innovation and technological change, not what benefits sort of the first world and first world problems, but really folks at the bottom of the pyramid. So how can you improve hemoglobin levels in children using technology? And how can you look at food and energy security issues for folks at the bottom of the pyramid? I think those changes will profoundly, I think, change the structure of the global economy, and that a lot of that innovation and ideas will come from those parts of the world.
I couldn't have said that, but I would have said digital, digital. And we spend a lot of time looking at what our operating plan to the future will be to enhance and improve worker safety, to minimize our environmental footprint, to improve planning and ultimately productivity. And just in the short few years, over the last decade, I've just seen so much change in how we operate these facilities and the application of technologies to really deliver a better product in a more responsible way.
Thank you. Paul?
Automation. So, I mean, obviously with a large mining sector, you're going to continue to see that taking place. Very specifically on the diamond side, obviously we're under threat from synthetic diamonds. So if you looked 20 years ago, what drove the Canadian diamond boom was the whole concept of blood diamonds. That's become much more on the back burner, and now we're focused on dealing with synthetic diamonds and emerging markets. So if you look at North American millennials, not as interested in owning diamonds. Turns out if you are struggling to pay your student loans and rent, the last thing you're thinking about is buying a diamond. So China, India, sort of focus on those markets, right? But automation is also a critical factor.
I agree with all three of them, automation and innovation. But on a macro level, as far as the tech sector in BC is concerned, I think we will surpass Montreal and become the second largest tech sector in the country. I think we'll see all of the multinationals set up shop here over the next 10 years. And I'm pretty confident that we'll create half a dozen more unicorns homegrown in British Columbia.
One more question, turning to Peter. Can you provide a breakdown of the $600 million Indigenous commitment by community-owned corporation, member-owned, and joint ventures? What is the real net tangible benefit for Indigenous communities?
So I won't provide a specific breakdown, but I will, however, talk about the tangible benefit to Indigenous communities. And it's not only the large amount of revenues that are generated in these communities through the construction phase of a project like LNG Canada, but more importantly, it's the sustainable benefits through training up of Indigenous people for long-term service contracts on which we can all benefit, that provide a stable source of revenue that can be funded back to help improve the communities. And that's really what it's all about.
So final remarks, one at a time, starting with Raghwa, so we close the session.
Sure. So as I mentioned before, BC's tech sector is on fire, and if you listen to Sue's presentation, if just imagine investment of roughly $400 million more into the tech ecosystem over the next 5 years or next 4 years, that will continue to enhance what we're doing and grow. So we'll continue to grow. I think we're on a great trajectory, and there's no stopping there. I think, as I mentioned, our companies are among the best in the world. Some of the innovations that I talked about, are happening right here, and we're actually changing the world that way. And the last message that I'm going to leave with for everybody is that we need to embrace innovation and adopt technologies for most of whether you're in natural resources sector, traditional industries, or whatever, for you to be competing globally, you need to embrace innovation. Innovation not just in technology, innovation in thinking, and then adopt new technologies to be able to compete globally.
Great. I'll focus on the Indigenous business space. I think it's a very exciting space. Today's modern age, you're seeing Indigenous business really maturing in the country. Federal commitment recently to grow federal procurement of Indigenous procurement from 1% to 5%. So you're going to continue to see that flourish. I think we all, whether it be industry, government, et cetera, there's a need to really identify and remove barriers for Indigenous business to grow in this country. It really is the key that unlocks a lot of potential and opportunity, whether it be on the resource side, land development. I just sat down with Squamish First Nation when I was in Vancouver last week that are building 3-4 major towers in Kitsilano. There's some very progressive groups out there that are wanting to grow, develop, looking for good, strong partners to work with, industry, et cetera. Invest in them, and we can all grow together. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just leave you with the fact that LNG Canada now is in its second year of construction. It really is a going concern. In fact, last night we drove our first pile to start our construction of our facility, so it was a big milestone for us. We're constructing this in a responsible fashion that is environmentally friendly and have taken into account all of the input from local First Nations and stakeholders through a large amount of consultation. I'm personally excited to be a part of this opportunity, and it's an opportunity not only for us here as British Columbians and Canadians, but it is an opportunity for the world.
When I see the number of Canadian companies expressing now an interest in India and Indian companies expressing an interest in Canada, it convinces me that in a world of brain gains and brain drains, Canada and India represent a brain chain, a chain built on trade and investment, ideas and innovation. And British Columbia has a very special role to play because it historically has done so, and look forward to its continued leadership. Thank you.
Thank you very much.